Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to the Union tonight. I'm Jess. I'm the Women's Officer here at the Union for this term, and I'm delighted to welcome Tarana Burke this evening. Tarana is a civil rights activist from the Bronx, New York, who founded the #MeToo movement. In 2006, she began using the phrase Me Too on social media to raise awareness of the pervasiveness of sexual abuse and assault in society. Time magazine named her among a group of other prominent activists dubbed the Silence Breakers as the Time Person of the Year in 2017. Burke presents at public speaking events across the country and is currently executive director of the Me Too organization. Tarana Burke.
Thank you. Hello.
So, a very warm welcome from everyone at the Cambridge Union. So, you first started using the phrase Me Too online in 2006, capturing a problem which has been a problem for women for centuries. Why do you think it took until 2017 for #MeToo to become a global movement? What do you think it was about that moment that stopped women being ignored for the first time properly?
Well, we started using Me Too not online, actually. Started in the community. It was how we labeled our community work around sexual violence. In 2006, we joined MySpace, which was y'all remember MySpace? Okay. Predecessor, obviously, to like the Facebooks and Instagrams of today. And that was simply just to have a place to live on the internet, which was sort of this growing thing that you had to be a part of at the time. I think that even in 2006, 2005, when we first started doing this work, people were not excited about it necessarily. We got a lot of response saying, thank you for doing this, and this is so necessary, but it wasn't a groundswell of support. It was mostly survivors looking for community. I think what happened in 2017, well, really prior to 2017, right? There were some cases leading up to that were in the mainstream media. The Cosby case and the cases from Fox News, and they were, sort of one behind another. There were these high-profile cases involving sexual violence that had really poor responses in the mainstream news, particularly the Cosby case, right? The way they treated the women that came forward. And then we had the election in the United States, and we had somebody in office who was a self-proclaimed sexual predator. Out of his own mouth, he said it. And I just think that for so many people, it was a bridge too far. I think the groundwork had been laid, and it was coming slowly but surely. By the time the Weinstein articles came out in September of 2017, it was just like another thing, and it dropped like a ton of bricks. And then you had these very famous women who were coming forward, and we had never really seen anything like that. Prior to that, there were high-profile men with lesser-known women coming forward, and people could drag them through the mud. Not that they didn't do that with the Weinstein accusers, but they could vilify them in a certain way. Oh, they're gold diggers, or they're trying to be famous. But here you have women who are already famous, who are already wealthy, or beautiful, and revered in all these different ways, who are saying, this happened to me too. It kind of put a pause on these other things and made people pay attention in a different way. And so there's a lot of conversation about sort of vilifying those women but the bravery of those women to come forward. Because remember, Harvey Weinstein is one of the most powerful men in Hollywood, and clearly, as he had done, could make and break a lot of careers. And so a lot of them didn't even know what was going to happen to them after coming forward, but they did anyway.
Mm. So if it kicked off with famous women who were accusing, obviously still more powerful men, what do you think that the movement that most people would now label as Me Too, that moment with the Weinstein cases, given that your hashtag, the aim of it is to include all women, are there any ways in which you think the Hollywood co-opting of Me Too narrowed the sense in which you were using it, or do you think that it was representative enough? Well,
I think that when it went viral in the mainstream media, nobody knew who I was. And so it did, my being inserted into the mainstream narrative around Me Too happened after Me Too had started to go viral. So people had to find out what the movement was that I started. And so, no, the thing that went viral and the basis for it going viral was not based on what I had started doing. I was doing work in community, very focused on survivors. But at the heart of it, we were talking about the same thing, right? And the reason why it resonated, and when I was able to insert myself in the conversation and say, hey, this exists, and this is why, I think people wanted context, and they wanted to know why this resonated with them, and they wanted to know why they felt so compelled to be a part of it or to stake a claim of this as a part of the movement. And so coming in and say, well, we're talking about empathy, and we're talking about survivors, and we're talking about healing, it added another layer to what was happening. But the mainstream media is not interested in the contextualization of this, right? They're not really interested they haven't been really interested in the heart and the meat and potatoes of what the movement is. They are trying to get people to click on a story or to buy a newspaper or a magazine. So how it's represented in mainstream still doesn't represent the work of the movement and the heart of this, of how it started and where it started. Even though some of the folks in Hollywood who were part of that initial wave are very supportive, and they continue to defer to me and say, this is Tarana's work and we should talk to her. It's still sometimes a battle, but I don't blame them. I blame that on our obsession around, famous white women.
Yeah. And if we're thinking about the way the media has handles it, if the aim of Me Too is to encourage discussion and nuanced discussion, if we're talking about everything on a spectrum from everyday bad sexual encounters to extreme sexual violence, how do we get the media attention and the public attention that these issues need whilst retaining nuance and not being reduced to sound bites? How do you think that
Say it again.
happens? So if we're trying to open up a conversation that requires nuance and requires like long discussion, how do we do that in a mainstream media which is more concerned with like tweet sound bites and as you said, like clickbait?
Well, I think we have to, in our work, we're really strategic about, how we use the media and what we put out and what we say. But also, I talk about the spectrum of sexual violence, right? And people say, well, is this Me Too? Is this a part of the Me Too movement? Is this not a part of the Me Too movement? The spectrum of sexual violence is everything from harassing language and behavior to really violent behavior that we know of, even to murder, right? And so there's a way to talk about all of that. All of that is important. All of that needs to be dismantled in order for us to end sexual violence. And the media can take bits and pieces of it. Part of the problem that we have now is that they keep focusing on one part of the story. If they would pull back and look at the full spectrum of sexual violence, there's a lot to talk about, and there's a much fuller story to have. And so our job is to keep pushing that and pushing them, but it's also to sometimes create our own media. Sometimes we have to get behind the scenes and create our own stories and get into the rooms where these stories are being made and help manipulate those things so that they tell a more full and detailed story. Because if we leave it to the people who have been telling these stories, we're going to continue to get the same things. I think another narrative change and narrative intervention is a really, really big part of this movement that we don't talk enough about. The things that influence people, the things that you hear, you see, you go on social media, you see a headline for a story, and people think they know the whole story. Most people don't click, or they click and they read for 30 seconds, and they get enough to argue with somebody else online, right? But not really have the whole story. So if we're not driving them and telling the stories, making the documentaries or the TV series or what have you, then we're leaving it up to the people who have actually helped to create rape culture to now tell a story that's going to dismantle it. Doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and so thinking about those people who have traditionally told the stories, if we're there's a lot of positive work that we can do to create those stories ourselves, but what do you think about the backlash that we've seen to the Me Too movement, which we obviously can't control, and things like talk of witch hunts and like #NotAllMen?
Yeah, I think it's lazy in a lot of ways, and I think it's people are very uncomfortable with what's happening, and so it's easier to lash out with little information than it is to sit back and see what's really being said. So we get these accusations all the time that it's, you are just indiscriminately calling all men animals and rapists and whatever, and you're just telling us that we should believe anybody that comes forward and says that they've experienced sexual violence. And it's these polar opposite extremes that are actually not happening. If you actually listen to what's being said, that's not happening. I'm not responsible for the people who are ranting and raving on social media, If you want to know what's actually happening in the movement, you have to listen to what people are saying. And so in no part of I was just having this conversation with the young lady upstairs for the newspaper. The first thing is that, and I think we have actually done a poor job of this, and I'm trying to make sure we do better, and that is that this is not a women's movement, right? Me Too is not about women's empowerment. And I think when people just kind of couch it with other things like that, it takes away from the breadth of what we're trying to do. It is a survivors movement, and survivors come in all stripes. Sexual violence doesn't discriminate. And so anybody can be affected by sexual violence, and so our movement is open for all of the people who have experienced sexual violence and for the allies and advocates who want to put an end to it. Largely, that's women. Right? Largely, it's women who are going to come forward and tell their stories. Largely, it's women who are at the forefront of doing this work. It always has been. That doesn't make it a women's movement. It does make it difficult, though, sometimes to convince men that they should be a part of this, right? And they see themselves as the adversary right away. A lot of the backlash we receive is because we don't have space to have a nuanced and really rich conversation about what work is entailed. What do we need to actually move the needle to end sexual violence? We're not attacking anybody. The Me Too movement is not responsible for going after people. People, women, a lot of times come forward and they make an accusation or they tell their story, and it puts somebody in the hot seat, right? Because now the thing that you thought was going to be a secret is out in the open. We're not responsible for that. We didn't do the behavior, but we are here to support the people who come forward. We are here to talk about how this contributes to the larger issue of sexual violence. We are here to talk about ways that we can dismantle these things. But what happens is people say, oh, Me Too, you just keep going after so-and-so and so-and-so, and that's all they hear, that's all they see, and that's not actually what's happening. The backlash is people being uncomfortable. The thing is this. People are going to have to be uncomfortable in order for change to happen. And if we can get past the discomfort, I was talking about these, a lot of times you hear men say things like, well, I would never do any of these things. I'm not really with that whole Me Too thing because I don't bother women. I always, don't call women out of their name, and I always get consent, and they run off this checklist of things that they're so good at, like good human beings should be. But then when you ask them questions about what they tolerate, there's a different story. How many rape jokes have you laughed at? How many things do you know that your guy friends did that were deeply inappropriate that you didn't call them on, right? Then we have a different conversation. I have the same conversation with women. How many young women call other women sluts just hearing a little bit of information, right? Or because they don't like them. We all contribute to rape culture. We all have a lot of dismantling to do and unpacking to do around it. And it's not directed at any one or the other, but men tend to get so defensive that we can't even get into this is what we really want you to do.
So in your daily life and work, how do you go about dismantling rape culture, especially if you're dealing with men who you say immediately go on the defensive, but even women who are unaware of the problems that they're contributing to, if with people who don't have explicit links to or experience of the extreme, the worst impacts of rape culture?
I think you have to be intentional. There's no question about that. You're not going to just, people experience Me Too online in this viral way, and they think, oh, this is great, this is so powerful, and I feel empowered by it, and they kind of, give it lip service and move on. But if we really are serious about dismantling rape culture, people have to be intentional. You have to, that could just mean something as simple or as difficult as thinking about your behavior. How many people have actually, so you may come home after this event and say, to your girlfriend and have a real conversation about, I actually do that a lot. Having that conversation and examining your own behavior, there's so much information out here. There's tons of information. If you want to get on the internet, you can get on the internet and find tons of information about what rape culture is and how we contribute to it. And then think about what you do. Like, a shift in your behavior is a very powerful way to impact changing rape culture. Making a decision that I'm not going to tolerate these things, I'm not going to contribute in these ways. We call them microactions. There are lots of ways you can be on the front line and you can organize, take back the night and all kinds of anti-rape this, whatever. But if you're doing that at the same time that you're holding up this culture, it's really not helpful.
So that's good to know that there are things that we can do on an everyday level. But in terms of a kind of more structural level, and thinking about the Cambridge context of Me Too, the university has recently shifted in its policy to judgment based on the balance of probabilities versus the legal standard, which is beyond reasonable doubt. So the people deciding whether to impose a punishment on someone accused of sexual misconduct have to be convinced that it most likely, the claim that the accuser is making most likely happened rather than beyond reasonable doubt, which is the legal standard. Do you think this is a good distinction? Do you think this is a change which you think should or could be made in the legal system? Do you think there are other changes which we should be making in the legal system to combat the difficulty of proving sexual assault?
So one of the things that I think I'm always excited about in colleges and universities is that universities are really small, microcosms of the cities and countries, right? You're your own community here with leadership and sort of a legal system and that whole thing. And because of that, these are places that you can try different things. You can experiment here, right? This is kind of what college is for. These are the places where you can institute new policies, test them out, see if they work, and colleges and universities should be less afraid to try and fail. So I think that it's important that we institute policies that the young people ask for, right? That the young people who are on the campus and experiencing and saying, this hasn't worked, we need to try something else. And the fact that the school's not afraid to try something else is a powerful statement that we're trying to do something about this issue, because it's an issue. I've never been to a campus where it hasn't been an issue on some level. And so I think it's good that they're trying out this new policy. I don't know if it's going to work, well or not work well, but I'm glad that they're trying it. One, I don't know that this crime and punishment framework that most people work out of is effective. And I mean that to say that so much of what happens around sexual violence doesn't rise to the level of crime, or doesn't. So you'll have a person who's had an experience that is clearly harmful to them, but there's no law or policy that covers it. You'll go to an authority and they say, I'm sorry, if this had happened, we could help you, but because it didn't, we can't help you, right? And it leaves the person without any recourse. What I would love to see is people move to operate more on a harm and harm reduction framework, because that means that you have to be accountable for the harm you caused. And that could look any number of ways. And then schools, universities, communities, the people who are engaged in enforcing this have a breadth of ways that they can deal with accountability. At the end of the day, people who experience sexual violence want somebody to be accountable for it. And if we can come, accountability may not be being kicked out of school, right? It could be any number of things. But if we're talking about the fact that you have to respond to the harm that you cause, it opens up the possibility of so many different things, and it gives the survivor the space to say, this is what I need to deal with the harm that was caused. So perhaps this policy can help in that, and I think after some time, once it's instituted, they'll see how effective it is, and if it's helping to reduce the instances of harm being done on the campus, but only time will really tell. I'm not sure if it can be replicated as a law, but this is a great place to see.
Yeah, no, that's such a good distinction between harm caused and the cultural changes that we've been talking about rather than legal impositions. And so I think if we're thinking about cultural changes then and like education, what do you think is in working to both empower and protect young women or people who are survivors or potential survivors of potential victims of sexual assault. How do we strike a balance between teaching people that this is the way the world is, and will probably continue to be for quite a large part of their lifetime, and encouraging them to change it? How do we make sure that people know how to protect themselves and affect these changes, but also keep themselves safe?
You know, I have a daughter, and I've been doing this work a long time, and there's this really interesting conflict, I would say, that I had when my daughter became a teenager, and, you know, has been 5'10" and like size 4 since 14. So I was and would go out, and I've raised this really free child that can, you know, I say dress how you want to dress and express yourself how you want to, and all of these things. And then I was faced with a child who wanted to go out into the world. And do I tell my child now to not be free? You know, do I go against the things that I've been teaching to other people and preaching to other people because I want my child to be safe in a particular way? And where I landed around this is that I was really clear that I wanted to teach my child to be vigilant but not fearful. And that's sort of where I shifted when I talk about this. I think it's prudent and for us to be vigilant, just as human beings. You're out in the world, and the world we haven't dismantled rape culture, right? We have not had massive interruption in sexual violence. So you do have to teach people to be vigilant, to guard your drink, or to, you know, carry mace, or whatever the thing is that you're gonna do to make yourself feel more protected. But I don't think it's helpful for us to send people in the world fearful and with anxiety about this thing that's impending. And I think that shift, it could be minor for some people, was really major for me in how I operated with my daughter, because it allowed them to still have the freedom that they needed to have to grow as a teenager, but also to be smart about the decisions that they made and be smart about how they move through the world.
Yeah, I think that leads me really nicely on to my next question about the example of your daughter, because there is a generational shift and relationship in the Me Too movement.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering what you think, if you think there has, whether Me Too has exposed a generational divide or brought generations closer together, and whether there are any other aspects of the feminist movement generally that you think there have been divisions exposed, what Me Too has shown us about feminism between generations.
Well, in terms of, the really interesting thing for me is, prior to Me Too going viral, I'm how old am I? 46. And so prior to Me Too, it went viral when I was like 44. I realized I spent a lot of time, and even though my work was built on working with young people, I hadn't worked directly with young people in a few years. I realized I spent a lot of time away from young people, and in direct involvement with them. And since it's gone viral and I've been traveling and working more with young people and on a lot of college campuses, the thing that I'm really clear about is that your age group, the analysis and the readiness around this it's just far beyond where we were at this age, and I think even where my generation sits now. And so, a lot of the work coming out of my generation is reactionary to some degree, and I think the young people, what I love is when I come to college campuses, a lot of the young feminists that I meet just get it and have a broader and more inclusive and more thoughtful analysis than I had when I was 20-something. When I was 20-something, I wanted to do something about this, and I was determined to do something about it, and just like jumped in and learned as I went along. And I meet a lot of young people who just get it without a lot of prodding and teaching and probing. And also, I think you all have just better ideas, right? And I'm not trying to suck up because I'm in a college, but just, I honestly think I'm just waiting for, I say this all the time, I don't want to be the face of Me Too in 5 years or 3 years even, right? I think this should be a younger person who's thinking about this, who's in this in a different way than I am, who says, Tarana Burke, I think what you started with is great, but I want to build on that in this way or take it in another direction. So I don't know if there's a divide necessarily, not from my perspective in the work. I think there's a lot to learn from this generation, and I think that this is also the generation that will bring a level of action to the movement to end sexual violence that we haven't had. Because if you think about that first week that Me Too went viral, I think, honestly, one of the failings of big institutions who've been doing this work for decades is that there was very little response right away. There were very few people who said, if you said Me Too, call this number, or here are some steps you can take, or here's this program. There were grassroots folks who did that, but we didn't get the ones who get all the resources in the field who came forward and said that, because, quite frankly, there's what's the word I'm trying to say? There's sort of there's like an old wheel that just keeps turning, right? They get the money to give services to survivors. They don't see us as powerful people, right? We are largely victims who are there to get services, not people who can be empowered to make change around this issue that's affected our lives. And if you don't engage us in that way, then when this moment happens, then we don't look like millions of powerful people coming forward in a unified voice. We look like a bunch of other clients. And I think this generation thinks differently than that, and so I'm excited about that.
So do you think the difference, both the difference in terminology, but also the difference in attitude between victim and survivor has been a generational? Is that something that you've noticed?
Certainly. I think also this generation has sort of been raised in this language in a different way. I'm coming from the generation that made the switch from victim to survivor. That was a part of our empowerment to say, I'm not a victim, I'm a survivor, and I think people take to it now quickly in ways that we didn't. It took a minute to make that transition, and so people either hearing survivor from the time, being raised hearing that language, or hearing it now and saying, that makes sense, and running with it. And that language change is very important. And it also helps people to engage us differently. When you're engaging us as survivors, it feels better to have overcome something than to succumb to something.
Definitely. Do you think also would you say there's been a gender shift in engagement with feminism and these issues in this generation? Do you think men are more receptive in this generation to getting involved?
Yeah, I've certainly met more young men feminists and young men who just get it and want to be a part of it. I was in Canada the other day, and this is the first time this happened. I've been brought to schools to speak sponsored by fraternities, so that's a little bit different. But I was in the Ivy Business School, and so many of the questions came from young men, and so many of the questions were not, what can I do as a bystander, but like, I'm studying the economy, or I'm studying, social entrepreneurship, and how can I take what I'm learning here and utilize that to impact this issue? And I was so impressed with that, and the way that they were thinking about how they can use their skills to really impact this movement, because they saw themselves as a part of the solution.
That's so good. That's so good to hear.
Yeah, I was excited.
I've just got one final question, and then we'll open it up to the floor if you want to start thinking, which is that say Me Too does kind of two things, which is, firstly, it just asserts female solidarity and like builds a group, and then secondly, it shows the pervasiveness of the problem that we're talking about. Do you think that either of those two things is more important, and what power do you think just saying the words has, regardless of the movement that we then affect?
So yeah, the saying the words is not necessarily about the movement. It is about having to be able, look, when I first started this, it was about survivors talking to survivors and being able to look at another person and say, that happened to me too, right? And the power that was in that, the deep empathy that you can have with another person, knowing that we may have dealt with very different actual things, the physical things that happen to us, but the trauma that's left over, we recognize that, and we know what that looks like in each other, and you don't have to walk through that alone, right? That's the power in saying the words, and it's still the power. It's why people, I try to get people into the mind of a survivor sometime. Writing #MeToo on your Twitter feed or your Facebook page or what have you is not just an ordinary thing. There's thought that went behind that. And I think about the people on the day that it went viral who watched it happening and thought, should I say it? What if I write this and nobody likes my status? What if people make fun of me? What if the person who did this sees me? You know, there's so many thoughts that go into making that decision to actually say it. And then there's the other side of it, of once it's said and you're greeted with community and you're greeted with people who say, me too, other me too's, or you're greeted with people that say, how can I help? And you see that there's life on the other side of this declaration. It is absolutely necessary. You can say me too and that be the end of it. There's nothing that says that you have to now embark on all these other things. My hope is that it's an opening to a healing journey that people need, and that it's the start of people knowing that there are things out there to help them heal and come back to themselves. But I said 100,000 times, Me Too can be the conversation starter, or it can be the whole conversation. That's the point of it. And that solidarity is important, just knowing. But there are lots of people who actually don't ever say Me Too out loud. Sometimes seeing Me Too and saying it in your own mind is enough. Just seeing the sheer number of people who share this thing with you is enough for a lot of people. So I don't compel people to say, you should say it. If something happens to you, you should absolutely say Me Too. If you write it in your journal, if you whisper it in your pillow, if you just close your eyes and say it to yourself, it's fine. It's about getting it out of your body, not about telling the whole world. And there's a solidarity in that as well, right? The reason why I'm up here, the reason why I'm public and talk about this out loud is for the people who can't say Me Too, right? They're just as important as the folks who are able to say it. So there's so much to be said about the solidarity of it, but what was the other part of it? You said, and then there's...
Yeah, and the fact that it shows that this is an issue that so many people experience.
Well, yeah, nobody can look away now. Nobody can say, like, when I meet people and they say, oh, I've never heard of that. And I'm like, I kind of don't believe you, but okay. But it's just we have with our bodies out loud given enough empirical data of how pervasive this issue is. You had 850,000 responses in 12 hours on Twitter. You had 12 million responses in 24 hours. In the first year on Twitter alone, there were 19 million tweets, and we've probably tripled that by now. So you can't ignore us. You can't say that we don't exist. You can't say you didn't know. You can choose to. You can be intentional about ignoring us, but we're definitely here. We're en masse. We have a voice, and we're not just here to say simply Me Too meekly. We're saying that out loud and boldly and louder every day, so you absolutely can't ignore it.